Hello and welcome back to this Down for the Duelist Crusade. In this video I'm going over the beautiful Hardy Boys editions that were sent to me by the wonderful Calvin Peters. So thanks so much, Calvin. These are some wonderful editions that he just literally sent me a message one day asking, because he was, I guess, parting out some books or some spares from his collection. So basically we wound up doing a little bit of a trade. So I sent him some of my spares that he needed. But these are all in excellent shape, and they're all beautiful original text editions, except for the later books, obviously. They're all in wonderful shape, but it also allows me to finally get into the whole other realm of looking at and collecting the Hardy Boys British editions, because in England they had their completely different version history. They didn't do the books in the original numbered order. They did them sort of out of order. Some never even got the revised text printed in the UK, and they had different cover arts and different variations that did have ties to the US editions, but it's a whole other realm of collecting the series. I've looked at some of this information before and I found it fascinating, but I never thought that I would get into collecting them because they very rarely show up here in the US, and when they do, they're usually a little pricey, or it's just a particular variant that very few people ever go into. So to go over the regular US text first, I'll save the British ones for last. First, he sent me this beautiful condition copy of a yellow spine of Cabin Island. So this is, of course, book 8. It has the yellow spine, and then it has the advertising for Bomba the Jungle Boy series on the back. So we have the updated artwork that would later be redone by Rudy Nappy on his version. This is listing up to the Yellow Feather Mystery, so that puts this at about 1953 as my guess on the printing. We have the classic orange Greta end papers, and of course it is a classic tan tweed copy, again making this dated to at least the 1950s. And with it listing to Yellow Feather Mystery, that coming out in 1953, about dates it to there. And in the interior we have the original text, but then the later version of the front piece art. Then the rear is advertising the new version of the Tom Swift series. Then he sent me book 17, which is, of course, The Secret Warning. I'm very excited about this one because my original text copy is a wartime copy, which means it obviously has the heavily browned pages. It's in good shape for a wartime copy, but I have been wanting to get a non-wartime copy as well. So this has the original artwork, which is, I think, one of the most 30s seeming of the Hardy Boys covers. Then it has the more orangish spine, the rear advertising the Tom Swift Jr. series. And this one lists to Ghost at Skeleton Rock, which would put this at about 1957. Again, with the classic tweed hardcover. Interestingly, this one doesn't carry any front piece art. I do believe this is one of the books that did eventually drop the front piece art on the original text after a certain point. There are some particular volumes where the art was either changed, but then there are a handful where it was just dropped altogether for certain printings. So this appears to be one of those. Here's a lovely copy of book 22, The Flickering Torch Mystery. Try to get the glare off. And of course, with the yellow spine, and then the rear advertising the Zane Grey series for boys. This still has the orange Greta end papers, and it lists to The Secret of Wildcat Swamp, which would put this at about 1952 in terms of the printing. Here we have the lovely front piece art, and again, a lovely 50s example of the classic tweed hardcover. Here is book 33, The Yellow Feather Mystery, perfect for winter reading. This is the original art that would be updated by Rudy Nappy, as most all were. This is where they transitioned over into the wraparound art on the spine, but then the rear is advertising the Tom Swift Jr. series again. You open up to find the classic brown and white end papers. This lists to Mystery of the Chinese Junk, which of course was the first book to not be a revised book, as book 39. So that's where the texts were published new and never revised. That came out in 1960, which dates this to about 1960, obviously. And then we have the front piece art. And then here is the tweed hardcover. Now, here is a beautiful first edition of Mystery of the Chinese Junk. And again, this is where we were still having the hardcovers with the beautiful printed art with a wraparound spine. Tom Swift Jr. on the back again, but still it being a hardcover before transitioning over into the printed on picture covers. So this still has the brown and white end papers. This again is a 1960 printing because it does list to Chinese junk, but the list is on the back flap. The front flap actually gives you the description of the mystery of it itself, which is always kind of striking to see because you're so used to seeing the list on the front flap and it not being a brand new first printing of that particular book. So again, here is the book listing on the back flap. So of course, here is the front art that everyone is used to with this book because of course this was the first book that was not rewritten at any point. Here is the tweed hardcover. Here is the next volume, book 40, The Mystery of the Desert Giant from 1961. Again, the art is printed on the dust jacket with a wraparound spine, and it does look more impressive than the traditional picture cover, which does change the dimensions a little bit, and you lose the wraparound spine. So it's always very striking seeing these when you're just sort of hardwired to think of the classic picture cover design. Advertising Tom Swift Jr. on the back. Once again, you get the description on the inside flap with the brown and white end papers, this along with the printed book listing, which is only in the actual book itself, listing to Desert Giant. That would indicate this is a first printing. The rear hypes the Brett King mystery stories. And here, of course, is the art we're all used to. And then here is the classic tweed for Desert Giant. Now, as I said before, this is where things get really interesting because he also sent me some British editions, and they're looking at the British publishing history of the Hardy Boys is a completely different experience to what we're used to here in the U.S. They changed hands in terms of who published them a number of times. They followed their own unique numbering. They didn't really start coming out in England until the 1950s, and not all of them had their revised texts published. As far as I'm aware, some of the revised texts have never actually been published in the UK, and the original text of those certain books is what you're going to come across. Thankfully, a number of fans have written wonderful articles for some of the various collecting websites and just general information websites, but it is the website hardyboys.co.uk that really has a phenomenal publishing history and gallery of all the different editions, which I just started consulting because I was trying to figure out which of these came from where, because I had only known a little bit about the British editions. I knew they followed their own order, and I knew that they had some different cover art, but that was about it. I didn't know the extent to just how they sort of pick and chose what they went with. So these will look slightly familiar in terms of how they look similar to the U.S. editions, but they also have their own distinct differences. So this first one is of our Book 12, Footprints Under the Window. Now this is from the publisher Harold Hill, who started doing the Hardy Boys in the UK primarily, but then they transitioned over to other publishers. This is custom art for this edition that is similar to what was being done in the 40s and early 50s in terms of the yellow spine covers. It does have a distinct look to it. All of these covers done by the artist Frank Vardy they're very, very colorful. They always depict a scene from the book, and since it's original text, this is a scene where it takes place in the Chinese laundry, where they're basically starting to fight with a gang. But as you can see, it is extremely colorful, but it does keep the Red Hardy Boys logo. It does try to look as close as it can to a U.S. edition, and it does a version of the yellow spine. As you can see, though, the logo is a little bit different, and at the bottom you have the logo for Harold Hill. It is numbered 12. Some of the books were published under their original U.S. number, but not all of them. In fact, I think the most striking part of these particular editions is actually the rear cover, because it gives you a full sort of comic page ad for the next book. It's not just, oh, look at the books in the series. This is directly giving you scenes from book 13, The Mark on the Door. So this is one of the examples where they did go in sequence in terms of the British editions. So that's another interesting, unique identifier of a British edition, along with the custom artwork. If you were to open it, though, it would look familiar because we have the orange Greta end papers. You will note that the actual flap is much bigger. But the way you know for sure you're not looking at an American edition is if you were to take the dust jacket off, they didn't have the classic tweed or some version of the brown that we're used to, and they weren't the original red. You might think they would have the original red boards like the original first editions in the 20s and 30s, but no. They did a whole variety of different colors. They didn't just have one. So this one is a nice, bold orange, but it still has the classic logo of the boys you're used to from the tweed covers. So this is a very unique element to these. The rear is blank, of course. This is orange. There are some that are green, some that are red, some that are brown, some that I think are even yellow, apparently. So they didn't have a uniform color. They all have these bold different colors, but they do have a version of the logo. It is printed on there, and it does look very similar to the classic tweed of the 50s and early 60s. But this is how you know for sure you're looking at a British edition. And of course, we have the original front piece art. They did reuse the front piece art on most of the books, but I do believe some had brand new art as well. So again, it's a sort of hodgepodge of they took various elements from the U.S. printings and sort of did their own thing with them, but then tried to make it look as close as they could to the U.S. edition that was either current at the time or had been in print for a number of years. So this has a yellow spine. But again, the unique identifiers, the orange boards of the actual book itself, this wonderful comic ad for the next book, and again, having its own unique cover art. That makes these very interesting and very much appealing to collectors like myself. And now I'm like, oh no, now I want to collect all the British ones too. What's wrong with me? So again, it is far more than just a different art and different numbering. There is... if you go to hardyboys.co.uk, you will find an entire website filled with all this information that I will now have to try and memorize and have in the back of my head, just like I do all of the U.S. printing info, because it is far more varied and long-running and detailed than you would think. Now we move on to book 20, which has the original U.S. art. So this is one of the books that uses the actual U.S. art. Not all the British editions had custom artwork. It's sort of a mix, but a good number of them did reuse the U.S. art. This has a cleaner version of the yellow spine. It looks very close to a U.S. edition, but if you look closely, you'll see, if I can get this to focus, it's still not the same logo. It still just looks a little bit weird if you're, comparing it to a U.S. edition. But it does look rather close, and you would you could easily think this was a U.S. edition, but it is not. And down here at the bottom, you'll see it says Samson Lowe, which is the British publisher that took over. So they started doing the books, and the printings changed a little bit. Here on the back, it advertises the Lone Ranger series. These are in some ways closer to the U.S. editions in terms of the earlier book I showed of Footprints Under the Window, but then in others, it's further away. So here on the dust flap, it lists a few titles, but it just has plain white end papers instead of a version of the orange Greta end papers. We do have the interior front piece art from the later U.S. printings in the 40s or so, and this is still the original text. So in terms of the actual book, it seems rather close, but again, when you have a British publisher listed, then you kind of know this is the British edition. But if you missed all of that, the way to know for sure, of course, is looking at the book itself, which is a red board. So it looks like a tweed hardcover from the 50s, but it's on a red board, and then we have a slightly bigger version of the title, and we have the classic logo. They're still printed and embossed, and they're, printed in, stamped in, like they are on the classic tweeds, but the dimensions look a little weird if you're used to the U.S. editions. So this is usually the ultimate test, if this is a British edition. Just look at the hardcover itself. If it's a different color, then it's a British edition. And again, you have the Samson Low credit there on the spine. Next is book 21, The Clue of the Broken Blade, which does reuse the U.S. cover art from this time period. So it's not the either of the Rudy Nappy paintings that came later, but this is the art that was literally from the U.S. edition at the time. So the British editions also will use the U.S. art. Some have the custom artwork like footprints I just showed you, but this one reuses the U.S. art, tries to look as similar as possible, and has the yellow spine. It does look rather close, but again, the logo is still a little bit different, but you could be easily mistaken for thinking this was a U.S. edition. These look a little bit closer. It doesn't have that wonderful comic ad, unfortunately. The dust flap is similar, but it only has a few books listed, and it just has plain white end papers instead of the version of the orange Greta end papers. Now, as you can see, they only list a handful of titles because that's all that was available at the time. So growing up in the UK, you would think that the series had only started a couple years before. The front piece art is from the US edition, but it is the drawn version from the 1940s editions. This is still the original text, but it does look very similar. So in terms of this being very close to a US edition, yes, it is. But once again, that does sort of get broken up when you look at the actual book itself, which is a redboard hardcover. The text for the title is bigger. It has a bigger version of the logo. This does look and feel like a 50s tweed copy, but of course it's red, and the sizes are a little bit different. But this is, again, how you know 100% for sure. Plus, it's a British publisher on the copyright page that you've got a British edition. Now, lastly, this is from the later Collins series. They started doing hardcover, they're essentially picture covers. So this is the British equivalent of the picture cover here. This one from 1972 of Book 7, The Secret of the Caves. Now, the art was done by Peter Archer, who did also the interior front piece art. These covers, I've seen some before online, and I really like what they did with them, and they seem very much inspired by the classic Three Investigators covers in terms of the hardcovers, at least to my eyes. These seem inspired by the Three Investigators, which is pretty much the other great children's detective series to match the Hardy Boys. But they're all really well done. They all depict an event from the text. This is the revised text, of course. But as you can see on the spine, there's also a lovely custom bit of art on the spine. I especially love the what looks like the dead hand sticking up out of the ground. But you also see the numbers printed on there, and it's book 13 because they follow a completely different numbering. So this is book 7, it's now book 13. As you can see, they started with Aztec Warrior as book 1, which obviously is not book 1. So the British books follow a completely different numbering and release order, and most of these are the revised text, but some are still the original text. Now, this printing is the revised text. If you open it, it's just blank white end papers. But some of the text is a little different and stylized. Again, this was done in 72, so I think that's why the font has been changed a little bit. Here's the front piece art. Now, unfortunately, as you can see, this book has very heavy tanning, so I don't know if that's common to these. My guess would be probably it is, because the pages are a little bit thicker, but it feels like that just seems natural to just age-related wear for this. But the actual text block seems to be copied over directly from the U.S. edition. Another thing is that it looks like they didn't replicate any of the internal illustrations that are iconic and part of the U.S. revised text. So it has brand new cover art, it has brand new front piece art, but it doesn't have anything through the rest of the book. And then the other thing I noticed is that instead of having the iconic blue dye on the top of the book pages, this seems, and of course it's very much faded, but it seems to have some green there. So I thought that was rather interesting, and that seems to be another identifier of the British picture cover editions under the Collins publisher. So here is a shot of the spines. So that's it for this particular video. Again, many thanks to Calvin for sending me these. These are some beautiful editions, and it allows me to finally start dabbling in the entirely different realm of the British editions, which I had known were different and had some variations, but I was not aware of how many variations and how it's really a completely different printing history in terms of the books in the UK and the various publishers and edition types. It's just as complex, if not strangely more complex than collecting the originals here in the US, simply because in the UK they seem to sort of pick and choose what they took from the US editions. So it's a completely different series to collect in terms of all the variations. So now I finally get to dabble in that a little bit, and it's another fascinating part of the seemingly never-ending realm of collecting the Hardy Boys and trying to research their publication histories, because just when you think you know everything about the US editions, then you start looking at the UK editions, and it's like, I have to start all over again because this is completely different. So many thanks to Calvin for these. These are wonderful. I always love being able to do book trades and talk with other people about really just book collecting, but especially it's rare that I get to discuss the Hardy Boys and my seemingly never-ending collection and just giant shelf full of blue spines. So it's a very refreshing when I get to do so, and that's why I started making these videos in the first place. So this is just this has been a wonderful experience, and just encourages me to redouble my efforts in collecting and researching the different editions, and now I'm delving into the British ones, which is something I never really thought I would do. So as always, I hope this has been fun and at least somewhat informative to hear me babble on about the boys even further, as I always love to do when given the opportunity. And as always, I want to encourage you to keep supporting local independent bookstores to help keep them in business, keep reading print books, keep enjoying the classic Hardy Boys series, and thanks ever so much for watching.